Why is sustainability so important for your organization?
Sustainability is very important to Fevia. It's really within our mission because last year we launched our sustainability roadmap. And this roadmap offers an answer to the question, what's for dinner tomorrow, but in the coming years as well. And we want to help our companies to keep on providing healthy, tasteful, but also sustainable food.
Sustainability is part of our DNA, I would say. We've got many legislations that are applying to our companies, whether it's export controls, sanction regimes, REACH, and many international standards that we try to achieve in order to be active internationally as well, that are all linked to sustainability. So that is the reason why we are already a very long active participant in sustainability programs.
Mm-hmm. An important aspect in sustainability is due diligence. What is due diligence?
Due diligence for me is the continuous assessment of risks, and risks for humans, so human rights, but also for the environment. And it goes beyond the risk that your own company or your own activities create.
Yeah. And sustainability has many aspects. If you look at sustainability and due diligence in particular, you have due diligence on labor, on environment, human rights, health, and all of that together is something that companies need to work with and incorporate it in their business activities.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you help those companies in a concrete way?
We have a couple of initiatives, but the most specific to the due diligence is the learning network organized by FIDO, and Agoria also participated with their own learning network, of course. And we organized 5 interactive workshops for 13 members and also 2 pilot projects. And what's the difference between the workshops and the pilot projects is that the pilot projects go way more into detail. It's a very individual guidance by Hiva Leuven and Sustenito, who also created and organized the content of our workshops. So it's really a very individualized approach to what is your company doing, what is due diligence, what are the risks for your company, and how do you mitigate them, how do you solve them, and how do you report on these risks?
Yeah, I mentioned it before as well. We have a lot of programs, whether it's Anti-Corruption Academy or it's Corporate Compliance Academy. We have now participated in this learning network on due diligence. And I think the most important element is that compliance is a more checking the box exercise. Did I do all of this and then I'm fine? Due diligence is really a plan, and Marie just explained that a little bit in more detail as well. It is looking at your value chain, it is looking at where are the risks, how do I identify them, how do I deal with those risks, how do I reduce them. So it's much more than just a checking the box exercise. And this is what we have tried in this learning network. We were with about 25 members, and then we also had these 2 pilot projects with individual members where we really tried to put the theory into practice.
Okay. Due diligence is more than just compliance, isn't it? How do companies deal with this?
I think the first important thing is to understand what you're talking about. What is due diligence? Because that's something that we noticed in the learning network. It's very hard for, and especially smaller companies, due diligence. It's about external risks. So it demands a lot of creativity sometimes to understand, okay, how far do I need to go? What is really envisioned with due diligence?
Yeah, due diligence also requires indeed to go beyond the compliance exercise. Where many of our companies ask us, yeah, okay, but do I have a checklist? If I have checked all of this with my suppliers and my subcontractors, am I then in line with the legislation? And the legislation actually doesn't require you to do a checking the box exercise. They want you to really incorporate due diligence in your corporate strategy, which means that it is something that has to live in all the divisions of your company, and that you work with it, whether you're a buyer or whether you're an accountant in the company or whether you're a CEO or CFO, that you know where you are part of compliance for human rights, health standards, labor standards, environmental standards, and that you have all of that in your DNA as a company in every aspect of your business activities.
Okay. And is there a big difference between small and big companies and the due diligence processes for them?
For now, in the new proposal for the directive around due diligence, SMEs are not included, so they're excluded from the scope. But during the learning network, we learned that there is a big fear amongst these small companies that bigger companies will actually cascade the risks, the costs, and the responsibilities that they have, because they do fall under the scope of the new directive. And they bring it to the small companies who have less resources, less time, also less knowledge available. So that's a big risk, and I think it's an indirect impact that we definitely need to consider.
Yeah, I think that is the most important aspect when you have to answer that question. Whether you're a small or a big company, there is an impact, either directly because the legislation applies to you as a big company, or either indirectly as an SME. A good example that we can give is that we have a member that participated in one of our academies. Only 16 people on the payroll, 1/6, but they are a supplier to the big companies like Facebook and Amazon. So they send their auditors, they send their questions, and the SME has to deal with it. So indirectly, you're always going to be impacted by the legislation that is now changing, and that is requiring from big companies to take up responsibility. And actually, there is potential for fines and prosecution for those companies all the way up to the CEO if they do not comply with these care plans that have to be worked out. So an SME is maybe off the hook from legislation, but is not entirely off the hook because the questions will come anyway.
Okay, you mentioned the learning networks. What are the lessons learned?
One lesson learned is that there is a real need for practical hands-on guidelines and tools, and this is something that is already accomplished by the small and medium enterprise toolbox, the KMO toolbox that is being developed by HIVA, KU Leuven, and where all companies, big or small, can go to if they want to know more about due diligence. And another lesson learned is that management really needs to be involved. As Kevin said, it needs to be part of your DNA of the company, and this is something that most companies are not aware of, but it really needs to be incorporated in who you are as a company, and you need to report on it as well. But there are many more other
Yeah, there are many lessons that we have learned. One of them that we have explained before is that many companies have a tendency to look at what's the risk for me. But in this case, due diligence is about what is the risk for others. But those risks for others can become now, and not just now, but in general, can become very quickly a risk for the company. But you need to have a different mindset. That's one. Another one is that, and we have mentioned the SMEs already, but this is also true for bigger companies. There are so many risks in a value chain, and especially when they're complicated, when you have different, up to 20 or 30 different chains in your entire value chain, it's very hard to address all the risks. So you need to be able to prioritize. Which are the biggest risks for me? It can be a tiny company with a lot of risk, or it can be a big company with less risks, or the other way around. So you need to be able to prioritize, and I think that's also maybe a message to the legislators that are now developing this legislation. They have to create a legislation that's practicable, because if you require from a company that they deal with all the risks and mitigate all the risk, if not they're prosecuted or they have to be fined, then the legislation will go way too far, because it will not be possible to live up to the ideas. I think here what we try to explain is the most relevant is actually when we would use a graph. You have little companies that do nothing, and you have little companies that are really pioneering in due diligence. But the majority of the business is in between. They do something more or they do something a bit less, but they're busy with due diligence. What we want is that a graph moves to the right, that you have more companies do a lot. What you do not want is that legislation actually causes companies to stop and say, look, I do not do any due diligence, and then your graph is just going flat, but you have not solved any human rights respect or improved human rights or health standards in the field. neither do you have business that is active in certain sectors. So that is actually what we try to do.
Disengagement is a real risk,
Yeah.
and we need to prevent it, yes.
We've learned a lot today. Do you have any last message for Belgian companies?
Get started. I would say really get started, because as we explained, there are many opportunities around due diligence, but there are also a lot of obligations that are coming. So be well prepared, and just to,
Yeah, work with due diligence. So we've now created this SME toolbox. Big companies can find inspiration there, but I think indeed the big idea is that SMEs can start. There are specific sectoral guidelines, because of course every sector has its own characteristics in their value chain. So those are there. Start, get ready, get informed, participate in learning networks, and talk to the CEO, talk to your division managers, because it's going to affect all divisions in every company.
we learned we cannot do it alone. We need help.
Thanks a lot for this conversation.
Thank you.